I interrupt my regularly scheduled programming with this Duff Reacts. I just read this article like just 15 minutes ago. I just read it over very quickly. And I said, I'm just going to read this article and react to it. What are my thoughts when I first read something like this? Like, Duff, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the latest in the salvo from Answers in Genesis against what they call young Earth evolution, right? They've had this series going. They had like 6 installments. Then Ken Ham put a pause on it for 11 warnings saying, look, we've had some complaints, but we're marching forward. We're not stopping. This is important to us. We got to call out these evolutionists within our midst. So the hit pieces continue. And yes, I have to call them hit pieces. I understand that Ken Ham wants to soften the blow and say that this is iron sharpening iron, and we need to have these types of discussions in a mature science and way. But there's nothing mature about not being self-aware of your own hypocrisy and then calling out others for things that you're doing yourself. Sorry, I guess that's the definition of hypocrisy, right? So, and I keep thinking it can't get worse. Every single article, I think that it cannot possibly be worse than the one before. And then what do? They manage to outdo themselves each time. So this week we have, in fact, just today, published, Humans, Are There Multiple Human Species? A complaint against Todd Wood and his work on an understanding from a young Earth creationist perspective, the fossil record of hominids. I'm just going to dig into this article let's just read it. I'm going to react almost sentence by sentence to what I perceive to be really incongruous statements, complete hypocrisy on the part of young Earth creationist at Answers in Genesis. Just bewilderment over the logic of the article. And then I'll try to explain along the way some of the problems in this article and what we might continue to expect from the rest of this series, which apparently is going to keep going for at least a few more episodes of the next few weeks. So Duff reacts to yet another article from Answers in Genesis calling out what they call young Earth evolution. We've got that coming right up. All right, let's dig into this article. As I said before, I just read this article moments ago, just briefly scanned through it. And I said, I'm just going to react to it. Just like, let's go line by line. And how do I react to individual statements in this particular article? And then this will give me a chance to sort of pontificate about this particular article and past articles in this particular series. So let's start out. Are there multiple human species? Can human evolution fit into young Earth creation? And once again, the subtitle to this is written to a young Earth creationist audience, and obviously it's written to the young Earth evolutionist as sort of a warning about what displeases Answers in Genesis. But nonetheless, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of young Earth creationist lay people, right? People in the pew who are wondering, like, what's going on with young Earth creation? What can I learn about it? Are going to read this article, and what they're first going to see is, can human evolution fit into young Earth creation? And of course, their answer is like, well, of course not, because evolution is wrong, and there is no such thing as human evolution. So obviously, it doesn't fit into young Earth creation. Are you saying that there are young Earth creationists who believe that there is human evolution and then it can be fit into young Earth creation? None of these young Earth evolutionists believe such a thing. And so immediately they're tainting the perception of young Earth evolutionists, casting them in a bad light just with this subtitle. I also want to point out the picture. Notice each one of these articles in this series has a little illustration that goes with it. The illustration is kind of like a lot of scientific papers today. They have a little illustration. It's called the graphical image or the graphical abstract. I mean, you should just be able to look at that graphic and say, oh, I get a sense for what this article I'm going to read now is about. And so here we have Adam and Eve, all right, the original parents. And then they have this sort of stepwise evolution where Adam and Eve are somehow either Australopithecines, specifically Sabida, or Sabida is one of the first branches off of Adam and Eve. And then eventually you have things like Neanderthals, and then eventually modern man. And so modern man is sort of at the pinnacle of this evolutionary series from Adam and Eve to present, as if that Adam and Eve then gave rise to multiple different species of humans. And so are there multiple species of humans is the big question that this raises. Now, this article, just like many of the past articles, has no author attribution other than this is a position statement of Answers in Genesis, which Ken Ham reminded us means that this is a group of people at Answers in Genesis that have formulated these particular responses. However, I'm going to say, just as I've said before, that this clearly has the fingerprints of one person on it, at least in terms of one person's vision in terms of writing this particular work. And sure, it might be massaged and crafted and approved by a group of people, but this is, just like most of the articles in the series, the handiwork of Ken Ham's, we'll call him right-hand man. So Huxley is really the one responsible for this particular series. So let's dig into the text. And where do you start? You have an abstract that sort of sets the tone, right? Sets the stage for the rest of the article, sets the mood. And how are we going to set that mood? We're going to start by mentioning Darwin, of course. Not just mentioning Darwin and the origin of species, but we're going to mention Darwin and his views of race, right? And how he divided races into different forms, which he viewed as being more fully human and less fully human. Those that were more closely related to apes and those not. Now, all I'm going to say here is that Darwin is not simply coming up with these ideas out of nothing, out of his head, and he created these particular concepts, but he's sort of I'll say more of a product of his age, the late 1700s and early 1800s. Nonetheless, he did split, he and others split humanity into different multiple races, or even call them, you could think of them as even potentially different species of humans. I don't like the word species here because I don't think species was necessarily the type of description was used at the time, but I know why Huxley is using this particular language in the introduction. In other words, humans were just highly evolved animals with wide gulfs between species. Again, emphasis on the word species here. There was different species of humans, and that was Darwin's view of different species. Just like other kinds of organisms, right? Were there different kinds of humans, just like different other kinds of organisms? We're going to look at that in a little bit. Like, are different races, are they the equivalent to dogs and wolves and coyotes, say? All right? Is that the implication? Is that the thing you're supposed to have in your mind? Now, some creationists are also saying there are multiple human species. So are there creationists who are saying there are multiple species, just like Darwin was once arguing, and for the reasons that Darwin was arguing? Do they have the same concepts, racial concepts, as Darwin did? Certainly not. Right? I'm going to say they're not arguing anything like what was the social milieu of the time in the 17 and 1800s. But this is the framework. This is the stage, the feeling you get reading this particular introduction. So what Huxley says first here is we got to define our terms. Right? This is something he frequently does in many of his articles. And he says, before moving forward, it's important that we ask two questions. What is a human? And what is a species? And I agree. It'll be really useful to know what Answers in Genesis, how they define what makes a human being. And it's really helpful to know what they think a species is if we're going to be claiming that young Earth evolutionists believe that there are multiple species of human beings. The second question can be answered only ambiguously. Now I ask, what happened to the first question? What is a human? On my first reading of this article, I didn't see anywhere where he defined what a human being is. Now, I think that he just assumes his audience knows what a human being is with respect to Answers in Genesis. And that is, human beings are all descendants of Adam and Eve. right? If you have Adam and Eve, or God created Adam and Eve, those are the first human beings, and all descendants of them, a monophyletic group, you could say, all descendants are therefore human beings, and that's what defines a human being, right? Well, that's defined in terms of ancestry, but what about other characteristics? How could you look at something and know it's a human being if you didn't know its actual ancestry? That would be another way of thinking or asking the question about how would you define or know that you're actually looking at a human. He doesn't even give the Adam and Eve and descendants description of what a human being is. At least I don't remember from my first reading of this article. So we're kind of left to wonder, and I'm spending a little time on this because it becomes important later in the article. So what about a species? That's where he sort of first starts, right? Says the problem defining species is so complex that historian of science John S. Wilkins has written that there are n+1 definitions of species in a room of biologists. In other words, if you get 10 biologists together, there's 11 definitions of species that will erupt from that. However, there is a weak consensus around a general definition of species using the biological species concept, sometimes called the BSC. Ernst Mayr, the primary advocate of this position, defined biological species as groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. This is by far the most common definition of species. Yeah, I would agree that is the most common definition of species. I will say within the context of talking about animals, right? And if you're talking about other groups of organisms, then that may not at all be the most common species type. However, Todd Wood explicitly advocates for a pluralistic view of species when talking about human species. So he's saying he's going to use multiple different definitions of species. All right, now we've already agreed. This author has already agreed that if you get 10 biologists together, you're going to have 11 definitions of species. Now, there is one that is most common, but just because it's most common doesn't mean that everyone believes that that is the only way to describe a species. That might be a pragmatic or a very useful way of describing them to identify a large number of things that we intuitively recognize as species. But every biologist recognizes it's a lot more complex than that simple definition that was given there. And Todd Wood certainly recognizes that. He understands that that identifying species or understanding what a species is very complex, and you can't simply relegate yourself to a single definition and apply it to every single circumstance. He wants to apply multiple definitions, species simultaneously, define groups, and he insists that when he says human species, he only means in a biological sense, not that they're somehow less than human, as all human species are descended from Adam. Well, okay, we've just run into our first question about what makes something human, right? And Todd Wood is saying what makes something human is that they are descendants, all right, from Adam. Right? He says human species, he only means that there are potentially different species of humans in a biological sense, right? So that means there's another sense of what makes a human, right? And that other sense is the one I already mentioned, right? Any descendant of Adam and Eve is a human being. And what we're going to get to is the crux of the question is, can descendants of Adam and Eve be different enough from each other to be called different species? And Todd Wood and other young Earth evolutionists are willing to use the labels, all right, of other species and be able to say that, yes, they're distinctive enough that you can identify a subgroup and call them a separate species. Now, please, before I continue, let me just be very clear that I'm going to use the term modern human or modern humans, Homo sapiens, of which everyone that's alive today, everyone that's been alive in the last thousands of years. So if you go back to the time of Christ and before that, every single person on the face of the earth is within the same species. There's really no debate about that at all. None of these young Earth evolutionists, Todd Wood, anyone, all right, secular scientist argues that there are different species, all right, of modern humans, Homo sapiens. So what we're really talking about here is the question of Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, neither of which are going to be mentioned in this particular article, which I'm definitely going to take a tangent on and talk about that. But we're also talking about Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, all right? And then Denisovans. And I'm probably even going to, I might even branch off and talk about, again, I'm doing this on the fly, so I don't know which tangents I'll forget and which ones I'll take. But might go talk about the samples from Spain, from the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of hell samples, and how different they are. So the real question that's being talked about here, all right, being discussed here, is whether Neanderthals, Denisovans, heidelbergensis, and Homo erectus, that's the other one I forgot, are they different species? Just like they are called different species by most anthropologists. All right. Remember Darwin, when he was talking about different species, and again, I hate to even use that word because not necessarily using the word in the same way, but this author, all right, Huxley here is intentionally calling what Darwin called species and equating it to what young Earth creationists are calling species. But in the case of Darwin, he's referring to things as different lineages within Homo sapiens, right? Not other lineages, right, that are extinct. Whereas the young Earth evolutionist, let's say Todd Wood in particular, because this article is going to be about Todd Wood. Todd Wood is recognizing that there are a bunch of other hominid fossils, right? And that they've been given different names, right, by various anthropologists. And his question is, are they humans, right? And when he's asking whether they're humans, he's asking, are they humans in the sense that, are they descendants of Adam and Eve, right? Oh, they are descendants of Adam and Eve? Okay, then they are human beings. What should we call them? I think it's okay. It's okay to call them Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis, right? Or maybe Homo naledi or Homo floresiensis, right? That there are these other recognizable morphologies and in some cases even just distinct genetic architectures, all right? Genetic profiles that make them different enough that you could classify them potentially as other species. All right, and yet they're still all humans because they're descendant of Adam and Eve. Let's get back here. I'm kind of ahead of myself here. Species do not tend to be defined by simultaneously using multiple concepts in biology. Actually, they kind of are in many cases. So if Dr. Wood wishes to combine multiple concepts, he must defy the normal accepted pattern of taxonomy and thus not defining species in a biological sense. Okay, this is, I don't even know how to say it. This is going to turn into so much gobbledygook that it's going to be hard for me to even really understand what's being said here in many cases. And it gets so contorted, it gets hard to even analyze at times. I guess what he's saying, if he wants to combine multiple concepts, he must defy the normal accepted pattern of taxonomy. Apparently the normal pattern of taxonomy, according to Huxley, is that you should only use one species definition, whatever you're studying, and thus not defining species in a biological sense. Because Todd Wood is trying to say that they're all the same, they're all human beings. And I guess the author here is thinking that that's like another species definition, saying that everything is descendant of Adam and Eve. All right, a little foreshort, a little bit of a coming attraction here, probably 15 minutes from now. All human beings are one kind, is what he's saying. And we're going to see lions and tigers and house cats are all one kind, and they're descendant from a common ancestral pair. And we call them all one kind. They're all one thing. They're all descendants of the same organism. All right. And yet we very comfortably call them different species. Alternative, he could define species in a biological sense, but then he must choose the concept of species he wishes to use. Not picking one of these options is disingenuous because it makes his idea almost immune to criticism. No, it just makes his view nuanced and shows that he understands how complex these issues are And if you want to criticize it, you need to understand the complexity of these issues in order to be able to pull out areas where he might have faults in his understanding. If he is criticized for his pluralistic approach, he can argue that he wants to remain in keeping with Scripture and keep all humans together. If he is criticized by saying humans are multiple species in the biological sense, he can point to pluralism by redefining biological species. Dogs, wolves, coyotes, and African wild dogs, I'm going to say in the biological sense, all right, are all different species. Right? They fit a number of different criteria for a number of different biological species concepts or definitions. But I could also say, like scripturally, like his argument here, I'm going to say scripturally that they're all the same kind, right? They all have a common origin. They're all related to the same original ancestor. All right, so apparently, but isn't that what Answers in Genesis believes? Didn't I just describe what Answers in Genesis believes about the canine kind? But that's somehow okay, right? So they have they're using dualistic understandings. They're using the word kind as if you're saying human. And then they're turning right around and they're using species concepts for biology to define different kinds and different types within, different types within those kinds. Different specific subsets within those kinds of genetic variation or whatever characteristic you want to use. Let's move on. I won't be here all night. Here again, the issue of clarity raises its head. Now, this is a common theme through all the different parts of this series, this Young Earth Evolutionist series. And the common theme is played out this way. The average audience will not know that a creation speaker means species strictly in a biological sense. They hear the word species and assume different animals like lions and wolves or coyotes and wolves. When they hear different human species, they hear that humans are not all the same. Right, so when you hear lions and wolves, and you see how Huxley is fudging here? He's pointing out two different things that are in two different kinds in order to create great contrast. And then suggests that young Earth evolutionists are saying species, and then what's going to pop into people's minds are lions and wolves, like really, really different things. When really he should have used the argument of wolves and coyotes. Two things that are very, very, very similar to one another, and are actually in the same kind, but all secular scientists consider to be separate species. Right? He's overplaying the differences here. Some might even hear evolution. Oh, right. So the problem is the average audience. Who's the average audience? The person in the pew, right? That's been mentioned multiple times in the series. The average person sitting there listening to a creation conference who doesn't really know much about science and has just heard about species, and they have just a general understanding of what a species is, like an intuitive feel for what a species is going to hear that, and they're going to hear talking about different humans, and they're going to be confused. I'm gonna say it again because I've said it before, and others have said this, and I appreciate even some of the young Earth evolutionists have pointed this out, that Answers in Genesis really does believe that their audience is not very intelligent, right? Right? They're playing down to their particular audience. Oh, let's go ahead here. Some might even hear evolution. Dr. Woods argues we don't want to pander to the ignorance of the masses. I actually agree with Dr. Wood there. We don't look at our audience and say, well, they can't possibly understand this, so I'm going to talk down to them. I mean, I do simplified in my class. I teach a general biology class. I'm not going to talk about some of the incredible complexity of some concepts. I'm going to simplify that for them. But the purpose of simplifying it is not necessarily to bring it down to their level, because their level is far lower than even that simple idea, right? Me explaining some concept, right? I don't think, what do they know? Oh, they know nothing. So therefore, I'm going to act and talk in their exact terms. And I'm not going to try to raise their level of understanding at all and help them become more intelligent about this topic. I'm not going to teach them what a species is. I'm not going to tell them about some of the nuances of the species definitions. right? We're just going to take the audience and keep them dumb, and we're going to castigate other young earth creationists for attempting to actually act as if their audience is intelligent enough to learn, all right? To actually experience some education and to come to a better understanding. Further, he is assuming that the evolutionists are right and that multiple species of humans have existed in the past. He's not assuming that. Answers in Genesis assumes that. I mean, they have names of things. They use the names of these other things that are different species names themselves. And then they say, oh, Neanderthals, they were fully human. They're human just like us. Right? They are human beings because they're descendants of Adam and Eve. Homo erectus, those were human beings. And they actually refer to them as Homo erectus, right? They have to use those terms. Are they assuming evolution when they use those terms? Or are they simply using the language that exists and then helping their audience to understand that Homo erectus is just like us, just like modern humans? They're all descendants of Adam and Eve. Right? Answer in Genesis isn't really doing anything different here. It is also perplexing for him to point out that the biological species concept is flawed and then appeal to it in order to have multiple human species. Now, nothing perplexing about that. Why are you perplexed? Why are you perplexed by this? Nothing perplexing about somebody pointing out that the biological species concept isn't perfect. And in order to apply an imperfect concept, it's proper to show the audience what the flaws are. What are the drawbacks of this particular viewpoint? Right? And here's another biological species concept, another biological or species definition, and it has various drawbacks. And this other one has different drawbacks. Right? The biological species has a huge drawback, and Todd Wood should absolutely point it out, while still saying, I'm going to use this particular concept because it's the best one we have and one that we can compare then to other organisms. So for example, the biological species concept, how are you going to determine whether you're reproductively isolated or not in fossil things? How do I know if this sample of Homo erectus found inside this, that is fossilized, how do I know that that particular individual that was fossilized could reproduce with other members of the human race? Right? I don't have any way of testing that. And yet the biological species concept kind of demands that I'm able to show that in order to be confident that it is the same species, that it belongs within the same species or a different species. So the biological species isn't going to be able to completely define it can't really define any fossils in terms of their species differences. So you're going to use other concepts like the morphological species concept. So you're going to mix, if you're talking about a group of organisms in which you have living representatives and ones that are extinct representatives in the fossil record, and you want to know how they relate to each other, you're going to use probably some combination of the biological species concept mixed with the morphological species concept and a variety of other characteristics, which is something that Todd Wood and some of his colleagues do. They have a variety of different kinds of analyses, statistical baraminology, and there's other things in which they collect various characters, and there's different assumptions, of course, that are involved in how they analyze those characters in order to identify commonalities between organisms and distinctions, all right, differences between them. And then you have to decide how much difference does there have to be before you can call two things different species, right? And so if Neanderthals have X number of differences, and depends on how you want to define species, and you might be comparing to lots of other different types of organisms and say, this is how we've defined species across lots of different animals. And if we have the same amount of difference within two groups of organisms or upright walking animals, we could call them two different species. But I could still, in the case of Todd Wood, I could still believe that both of these are descendants of Adam and Eve. They've just grown to have differences between them. Just like apparently Answers in Genesis does believe that you can have an ancestor that grows to have many differences in their descendants, and those descendants can be recognized at a biological level as being different species, while at the same time you can say they're just all part of the same kind. And maybe they don't reproduce that well with each other, but they have potential to reproduce with one another and hybridize with one another still. The problem here is that the evolutionary view of human species assumes ancient ancestry and significant differences in human species. Okay, well, I guess if you're the evolutionary view of human, he has this very generic way of saying this all the time, as if it's obvious what this means. I guess what he means is that the evolutionary view it uses like radiometric dating in order to establish the timing or the times in which some fossils existed, and those fossils are really old. And if they're really old, that means they have ancient ancestry. Then it's not surprising that there are significant differences, say, in their genomes or something like that. And we want to recognize those differences as different species. The way evolutionists think speciation works is phyletic, meaning that at any given point in history, one species branches into either one or two species depending on the circumstances. One species branches either into one or two new species. That's a little awkward the way that's said. You don't really branch into, one species doesn't branch into another species. One species might gradually change into another species, but that's not really a branch, right? That's just a continuation. One species can continue and eventually morph itself into another species later in time. So if you compared the descendant with the ancestor, you'd recognize them as different species. Then if you walked back their entire history, there would be a history of descendant, so forth, right? Parents of those, and then the offspring and so forth, all the way back to that other descendant, but the two ends would be different species. Or it could branch into two new species, depending on the circumstances. Actually, it could branch and one of them could essentially remain the same species, right? You could have one species remaining very similar because of something like stabilizing selection. You're in the same environment. Hey, seem to keep the same characteristics. All's great. Later on, so many generations later, it's still the same species. Other members of that species, other population, moves to a new environment, experiences different environmental conditions, which then shape that organism, select for different characteristics. They adapt to that new environment. They change their characteristics quite a bit. And so at some point in the future, I recognize that other branch. It is a branch now. It represents a different species, whereas the other branch is really the same species, continuing. It'll have differences because no species stays the same over time, ever. No species. Okay, so evolutionists think that speciation works phyletically, meaning that at one given point in history, one species branches either in one or two new species, depending on the circumstances. The implications of this for the idea of multiple human species is astounding. I'm sorry. This article is just ridiculous. The implication of this idea of multiple human species is astounding. It implies that man has been progressing upward through history until he arrived at modern Homo sapiens. Thus, the acceptance of multiple species of human people, at least indirectly, implies the evolutionary model. Okay, let's scroll back up here. See this diagram? You know how I said this is like the graphical abstract, kind of represents like the view of the author of the problem. Adam and Eve branches and forms Australopithecus. And then later on, there's another branch which gives rise to Neanderthals. And then there's another branch that gives rise to modern man. And then there's, I guess the idea is, but modern man is still advancing, right? And is still adapting and changing and will lead to yet another version of man in the future. So I guess it's sort of like there's this primitive version, and it's kind of relating the primitive version of human beings to Adam and Eve. And then they're advancing through these stages to get to modern man as if it's at the top. But I don't know which, does Todd Wood actually say that modern humans or Homo sapiens, people alive today, are like somehow like so much more advanced than Adam and Eve? Or is he simply saying there are differences between the two? We're just recognizing those differences. I don't know. There are some young Earth evolutionists who might argue, and I think it's actually a reasonable argument to say that Adam and Eve weren't just like, wouldn't necessarily be classified or are similar to all modern humans today, right? Homo sapiens. But that they probably had characteristics that were more like one of the other Homo species, if you want to call them Homo species. Answers in Genesis might actually agree to that too, that the original humans didn't have the same characteristics that we all have alive today, and they had a grouping of characteristics which was more similar to some things we see in the fossil record. And then they experienced changes over time. They just don't want to call them different species. All right, so again, kind of semantics at some point. The acceptance of multiple species of fully human people at least indirectly implies the evolutionary model. Yeah, so they're branching out and sort of like, they're evolving over time, and modern humans are like at the top of the tree, right? They're the most advanced thing that's shown up yet. And so that implies that humans are evolving and becoming almost implied to be like something better than was in the past. Well, this sounds kind of antithetical to what Answers in Genesis is inclined to say, which is the world's running down, right? You had the perfect genome and the perfect organism, really. Like Adam and Eve were absolutely perfect. Everything after them is like things falling apart. In fact, in many ways, I think they wouldn't talk about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of view Neanderthals as like a side branch, right, of the more perfect Noahic line, because Neanderthals and Sabida and Homo erectus and Homo floresiensis and heidelbergensis and the Denisovans, all of those lineages all had to be after the flood. And therefore, they were descendants of Noah. And if they're descendants of Noah, then they had to have branched off somehow and become different. And I think their explanation might be that, well, they moved to different locations and it was harsh and there weren't that many of them. And because of genetic decay, right, genetic entropy, they accumulated mutations and they experienced these changes that weren't necessarily making better for their environment. And so eventually they went extinct, because they have to kind of explain why aren't they around anymore, right? What happened to those particular lineages? Yes, the Neanderthals hybridized, and so their genes still exist today, but their particular morphology, right, which they do have a distinct morphology, doesn't exist today. So I kind of understand that Huxley here is making this argument that young Earth evolutionists are sort of beginning with kind of following the evolutionary trajectory of sort of a bush, of a tree, in which there's ancient human beings that then are deriving and giving rise to all these other branches. You know what? Now that I think about it, it's really not that different than what Answers in Genesis would draw out. Okay, so here, I'm just bringing up this picture from the Creation Museum. And so I was thinking wrong. They don't have a diagram right there of human relatives showing Adam and Eve to Noah to the branching. What they have is they have a picture of the great apes, the other great apes. And they show an original ape, common ancestor to all apes, and then it branches off into a bunch of different sorts of varieties of apes. And then you have the flood and it all gets constricted down. I don't know if you can see that. Let me try to make this a little bit bigger for you. So it branches off at the flood, and then after the flood, you see there's a single lineage that's coming through. And then that lineage breaks into a whole bunch of different lineages, many of which are extinct. And then, of course, the living lineages of great apes, which are the orangutans and the gorillas and the chimpanzees, or chimpanzees and bonobos. And so all of those are derived back to a common ancestor. Right? So not only are there different species, there are different genera. And not only are there different genera, there are different families of organisms recognized by secular scientists, but all included within the same kind. Right? Answers in Genesis doesn't have any problem calling these different species, different genera, different families. Right? So there are species here, and they were derived from the same common ancestor. So now, are they being evolutionists? If we go back to our language, all right, if we go back to our wording here, it implies that man has been progressing upward through history until he arrived at modern Homo sapiens. Well, I guess you could say they believe, the Answers in Genesis believes that there was a single great ape. That single great ape has been advancing through history, through the global flood, and then into a bunch of different varieties of apes, and then to 3 specific living apes. The acceptance of multiple species of fully human people at least indirectly implies the evolutionary model. Right? I could read that as the acceptance of multiple species, multiple different families of full versions of apes, great apes, because they believe they're all the same kind, indirectly implies the evolutionary model. I mean, how could you look at that figure and not suggest that they're implying an evolutionary model for how they're related to each other? Right? If they can argue that all those different apes came from a single common ancestor ape, how do you criticize Todd Wood and other young Earth evolutionists for suggesting there are other branches on the Homo tree, all right, the descendants of Adam, that Adam and Eve gave rise to descendants that were different enough to recognize as separate sort of branches on that tree of the same kind of thing, of human beings, right? And I'm using the word human beings here to mean all descendants of Adam and Eve, not Homo sapiens. Obviously, Dr. Wood and the other creationists who accept multiple human species would deny the implication, but it is still there, right? Answers in Genesis consistently, Ken Ham consistently denies that they're influenced by evolutionary models. And I would say, but yeah, it's still there, right? They clearly are influenced by it. Right? So again, the hypocrisy of these types of statements, the lack of self-awareness of this author to see that he himself is accepting of all these same things in many other instances, and to feel like this is something he needs to call out others for, absolutely ridiculous. To accept the concept of multiple human species implies that the biblical model that mankind was created perfect in the image of God a mere 6,000 years ago, and they subsequently fell and is suffering from a degraded genome, is false. There's the nub of it, right? That's what we were just saying a moment ago. This author, right, who I'm using as who's my nickname for him, Huxley. Huxley is saying here, seems to think that Todd Wood and others have this sort of upward progression model, as if human beings are becoming ever better and improving upon past versions of homins, or of Homo, right? That Adam and Eve weren't the best humans, that they are here now. I can't believe that any of them actually would say that. Right? They all believe that that Adam and Eve was put into place in the Garden of Eden and had a more perfect genome and a more perfect relationship with God, a more perfect relationship with the creation than any can possibly have today. Because they all accept that the world is fallen and it's actually infected the actual physical substance and being of human beings. All right, to ascribe this upward progression to them, and then contrast that with our view is, because what is Answers in Genesis view here? Obviously, it's that there was a perfect image of God, all right, a mere 6,000 years ago. And then Adam subsequently fell and has been suffering from a degraded genome. So if the genome is degrading, how could it possibly result in Homo sapiens, modern humans, which are so much better than the original humans? Candidates for multiple species. So who are these multiple species we're talking about? I've already mentioned a few of them, but Dr. Wood puts forth several arguments why he thinks there are multiple species of humans, including Homo erectus, Neanderthalensis, Sabida, and recently Denisova, the Denisovans. So let's see what does Todd Wood say? In the case of fossil hominids, well-known taxa, Neanderthals and Homo erectus complex known for numerous individuals. Yes, there are many of these, both of these representatives in the fossil record, well documented as different from modern humans. Any anatomist worth their weight at all should be able to identify and pick out a Homo erectus and a Homo neanderthalensis versus any modern human alive today, right? Any Homo sapien alive today, right? Now, if that's true, if any one of you could be trained very easily to tell the difference between these, that suggests there's a difference. Neanderthals in particular have good evidence of being separate species from modern humans. Neanderthals differ from modern humans in their morphology and development. The recent reported Neanderthal genome also revealed genetic differences from modern humans. The Neanderthal genome also revealed evidence of hybridization with Asians, but the levels were so low that one might conclude that Neanderthals in general did not hybridize with contemporaneous modern Homo sapiens. Now, I looked at that reference. That reference from 2011. Todd Wood's written a lot since then, and he acknowledges that there was hybridization. And why does he acknowledge that? He acknowledges it because there's plenty of evidence that there was a hybridization. That many of us actually have Neanderthal DNA in us. Now, this Huxley here is using this particular quote from 2011 to create a contrast and make it sound like Todd Wood is wrong. They're really not that different because they really did hybridize. He could have picked more recent descriptions by Todd Wood and how Todd Wood has talked about Neanderthals since, and I don't think Todd Wood has changed his opinion about the overall difference and recognition of there's a distinctness to Neanderthals compared to humans, despite that evidence of hybridization. So now back to Huxley. Yet, based on population numbers, a 5% hybridization still showing up after 4,000 years of massive human population growth, mutation, and dilution of the human genetics, as well as the degraded quality of the Neanderthal genome in particular, is actually a huge amount. It is quite a fair amount, but it's very specific in where it is. It's not just, I know what Huxley is trying to insinuate here. And it's a complex genetics argument about genomes, and I don't want to go all into that right now. But suffice it to say, he's talking about the fact that there was hybridization and there was enough of it that it still remains in our genomes today. If Neanderthals were one group who left Babel, and possibly a group who splintered off from a Babel group and moved to an inhospitable place like northern and central Europe and all over Asia during the Ice Age, how many other groups would we expect to have them mix their genes with? The same applies to Denisovans, and although very little fossil remains have been found, their DNA has also been found to make up nearly 5% of the genome of certain Filipinos, and its noteworthy percentage in some Malaysians as well, of Noah and his family. So, and even more specifically, they were at Babel all together. And then after Babel, they split off, moved to some areas in Europe. And sure, the Ice Age made the whole area inhospitable. How many groups would we expect them to have mixed their genes with? All right, well, yes, exactly. If they went off and went into an area where there weren't other human beings, and they were the human beings, and they're descendants of Adam and Eve, and they didn't have anyone else to mix with, they're going to do what you would expect to happen, which is natural selection and genetic drift and mutations and all this stuff is going to have an impact on their particular genetic pool, resulting in them having differences from other human beings. But not so much that they still weren't somewhat compatible, although I would point out it looks like the compatibility didn't go both ways. It went male Neanderthal with female modern human or Homo sapien. So those differences didn't preclude hybridization. Well, okay, Huxley, what about wolves and dogs, right? They're separate things, and yet they have a common ancestor, and they can hybridize still today. So we could call them, just don't call them wolves and dogs. Don't give them different species name. Call them the same thing, because they are the same thing. They're the same kind. Don't kowtow to your audience. Teach your audience to understand the differences here, what is going on. Dr. Woods then discusses how he selects characteristics which would be incorporated into his homology studies. Let's not read all this stuff. So he quotes a bunch of stuff from Todd Wood about how they rank families, genera, and so forth. And it's really about baromological analysis. Well, we've already heard Huxley complain about baromological studies and specifically statistical baromology, which is the thing that many younger evolutionists are into, and has a real thing against that. So that's just rehashing that. Right, all this stuff in here is all just about the weighting of characteristics and how one decides what characteristics one's going to use and not use and how to weight those characters when does an analysis. Remember, what we're talking about here is you've got a whole bunch of different fossils. And the question you're trying to answer, that any of these young Earth creationists are trying to answer is, if I pick up a fossil, how do I know if it's a descendant of Adam and Eve or whether it is the descendant of an organism that was some other created kind? That is essentially the question. And young Earth creationists can argue about what characteristics you use, what criteria to use to make that call. And Huxley and Answers in Genesis, they have ideas of how to do that, and they have particular criteria. And other young Earth creationists have different criteria for making those decisions. Now, Answers in Genesis, as I said, they make their calls differently. Here he's going to say, hey, David DeWitt and the late Dr. Menton emphasize certain characters like limb length and nose morphology, mainly because those are the two of the more defining physical characteristics of humanity when compared against apes. By the way, who did all that work? Evolutionary biologist, right? Anthropologist, determined that those characteristics are good characteristics to use. Menton and DeWitt simply are looking at their analyses and agreeing. So they're apparently influenced by evolutionary biology, right? I'll say not evolutionary biology, I'll just say evolutionist. Dr. Menton hammered home in many of his lectures that a slope face and a lack of bony nose bridge demarcate an ape and not a human. All right, so that's just all we're just saying is this is what Answers in Genesis uses as criteria. The criteria used by others look at different other characteristics and then sometimes come to different conclusions. This has been true for young Earth creationists all along. This isn't new for somehow this young Earth evolutionist group, right? ICR, AIG, CMI, sometimes all three of them disagree when they look at a set of bones and they say, like, is that a human or is that an ape? Case in point, Homo naledi. You notice that Huxley here is going to completely avoid the hard ones. He's going to avoid naledi. He's going to avoid Homo floresienses, more commonly known as the Hobbit. Right? The Hobbit has a very distinctive morphological set of characteristics. Right? And some creationists have called it an ape, and some creationists have said, "Oh, that's a descendant of Adam and Eve," and it's just the same thing. We're all human. Answers in Genesis calls Homo naledi an ape, very clearly an ape, in fact. Whereas Todd Wood thinks that Homo naledi is a descendant of Adam and Eve. So some of these bones had the image of God in the individual that existed with those bones at one time. And the other groups say that that was just an ape. It doesn't have the image of God. Those are very different points of view. Which one's right? None of these groups are consistent. Each one of them is seeking out a method of determining and establishing criteria for determining some consistent pattern of, I can tell this is an ape versus a human being. The fact that evolutionary biologists notice enough differences to not claim Sabita as human, or at least the closest hominid ancestor, seems incongruous with a young Earth creationist claiming that it is. I think this is really the beef here, right? Is saying that even the evolutionary biologists don't place this particular sample in with Homo. And so to Huxley, this feels like this is like is creating a continuum, which is what evolutionists are trying to do in his mind. Evolutionists obviously want a continuum from ape to human-like ape to archaic human to modern human, right? This sort of stepping stone model. Realistically, the only archaic humans they have now are Homo erectus, ergaster, habilis, Neanderthalensis, and Denisova. All of these are fully human, with just slight variations. By the way, you notice it says that all evolutionary biologists have that are archaic humans. It doesn't include Homo naledi. It doesn't include Homo floresiensis. And there's actually a couple others which I admit are more controversial, but I don't think there's a lot of controversy especially about floresiensis, that they are in the Homo group. So you should have included those here. All of these are fully human. So now here's the statement where Huxley is saying, the position of Answers in Genesis is that all of these are fully human, right? With just slight variations, much like we can observe in small and especially isolated populations today. No, that is not an understanding of the fossil record. That is not an understanding of the human fossil record. To say that these are slight variations between Homo erectus, Neanderthalensis, and modern humans, and those differences aren't any more than, say, differences in Homo sapiens today, right? Just variations in isolated populations. In other words, this author is suggesting that there are isolated populations on Earth today that are as different from each other, from us, unless you're one of those listening to me in one of those small populations, that are as different from us as a Homo erectus is, or other Homo. Really? Homo floresienses? Homo naledi? Now I know Answers in Genesis doesn't accept Homo naledi, but most other creationists do. And then he goes on to say Neanderthals were ranked as Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis, a subspecies. And this subspecies classification is seeing some renewal interest as more human-like behaviors attributed to them. Okay. And it's true that some anthropologists have called Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals, Homo sapien Neanderthalensis, which is just a subspecies of Homo sapiens. You could do that. They're not that different. But again, if you go to other species and other groups, are bonobos and chimpanzees different species? Or should bonobos just be a subspecies of chimpanzees? You can get all kinds of arguments there. Actually, I don't think there's any argument there. They're pretty clearly different species. But they're also not any more different genetically in a bunch of other characteristics as Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, right? So if Huxley wants to make this distinction that today there's just as much variation, that's just wrong. He's just wrong about that. Remember, Darwin didn't know about all this other variation, right? He didn't know about all these other fossil hominids. And so when he's talking about species, he really was talking about variations in races and species types within modern humans, much less all this other dramatic variation in other Homo sapien or other Homo groups. So for Dr. Wood to believe that his discontinuity hypothesis places Sabine in Homo, when even evolutionary biologists and anatomists see the difference, is baffling and confusing to those not well versed in biblical reasons for seeing mankind as all one blood and very distinct from each other, from all other created things. Again, Dr. Wood's not saying that they're different from all other created things. They're not a different kind. They are the same kind. He's just making a statistical argument for them being similar enough that they should be considered potentially as descendants of Adam and Eve. Did Huxley ever actually define what a human being is? Kind of says that they're descendants of Adam and Eve. Right? Does that preclude the idea that there could be species within the descendants of Adam and Eve? Is there anything in the Bible that says that Adam and Eve couldn't give rise to descendants that you could label biologically as different species? Is there anything there? Anything in Scripture that suggests that? I don't think so. After all, there are a lot of other kinds of things that God created, right? From the creationist perspective, there's a canine kind, right? And within the canine kind, is there anything that says that a canine can't diversify, become genetically different groups that have enough distinctive features that we can label them as being different species? And we have different species concepts, right? So under different species concepts, even younger creationists have acknowledged there's different species definitions. And depending on which definition they use, they might lump some things together into one species of canine, and others might separate it into multiple species. Like there's a lot of foxes, and some people have multiple species of foxes, and others have subspecies of foxes. Right? So, if you can have that discussion about foxes, why can't you have a discussion about descendants of Adam and Eve becoming a variety of different subspecies or different species? Is there anything biblical that says that can't be true? Because remember, young Earth creationists believe that if you're all in the same kind, you still have reproductive capacity. You're still able to interbreed with each other. I know you're saying to me, I know there's some groups like, oh, but Dr. Duff, foxes can't interbreed with wolves. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But what young Earth creationists say about that is that at one time they could, right? Their ancestors could. And because of genetic entropy, because of the decay of the genome, since the original more perfect genome in the original creation, remember Huxley here talking about how like Adam and Eve had like a perfect genome, all right? They're the perfect parents, and then it's all degradation after that because of the fall. And so young Earth creationists come back and they say, oh, well, because of the fall, because of degradation, populations of individuals living in different environments eventually get decay, and they have mistakes that are unique to different populations, and as a result you end up with the incompatibility of them with each other. They become incompatible. They do become reproductively isolated, and then they fit a certain biological definition, right? The biological species concept says they're biologically discontinuous, and they may have a whole bunch of morphological characteristics that are discontinuous, and you'd say like, oh, I can see that we're going to call them different species. However, even though we're calling them different species, what do? We turn around and we say, biblically, they're not actually different things. They're the same kind. And so Answers in Genesis is doing exactly the same thing that this author is accusing young Earth evolutionists of doing, of suggesting there are different species that are the descendants of a particular kind, but then still saying that they are the same kind. All humans are the same kind. Now, you might still object, especially if you're a Christian, you might object to the way I'm phrasing this and saying this. But I will say that I have a little bit different view than maybe most who aren't young Earth creationists. And it might be surprising. So I'll just go ahead and say it because it's going to create a contrast with what's here. I typically come down on the view that the descendants of Adam and Eve are all Homo sapiens. All right. And I don't tend to view other Homo species, right, as being human beings, as being made in the image of God. Now, I have a particular definition. I don't want to go into this right now, but I have a particular definition of what it means to be human. And I think that definition is probably quite similar to what Answers in Genesis might say. But I don't recognize the characteristics they're looking for to be in others other than Homo sapiens. I don't really have a problem with actually having different species. Because I know what some people are thinking. They're thinking, wow, man, different species of human. I know that's what this offers. If there's different species of human, it's possible they're reproductively isolated from each other. And then how can they be equal to each other? How can we maintain this idea of one blood? We're all one peoples, and there really isn't any such thing as race, right? We're really not that different from one another. Well, I agree. Like Homo sapiens, we're really not that different from each other. Biologically, we're not different from each other, either genetically or morphologically, right? We're all pretty much a uniform group. We do have some we have some different traits that we use to see each other as being different, but we're hardly different from each other. Compared to, say, Neanderthals, pretty sure if there was a group of Neanderthals, walking around, you'd be able to tell the difference between them, right? In erectus, and definitely Homo naledi, definitely floresienses, right? And if Todd Wood's right, Sabida, if they are descendants of Adam and Eve, these were very different groups of individuals. And I do find that to be somewhat, not more than somewhat problematic. I do have a problem, right, with what Todd Wood and others are doing. What I'm saying here is that Answers in Genesis, in Huxley's article, they shouldn't be having a problem with what Todd Wood is doing. All right? They're not that different at all. Okay, let me try to wrap this up with some general comments. I recognize that my scattershot approach at going through this article, it was not terribly successful. I'm being a little bit, going on a few too many tangents and not being very clear. But why is that? I guess maybe it's because I'm just still flabbergasted that this is representing a position statement from Answers in Genesis. That somehow this is so important. We're going to put this on the front page for a couple days, let tens of thousands of viewers see it, and say that it represents the viewpoint of Answers in Genesis, that it represents our concern. And that to me means you would think this is something that had been well thought through. It appears planned out in terms of a series, but the incoherency of some of the arguments, the lack of self-awareness in some of these arguments, and more importantly, the feeling like it's really written by one person, one individual, the fact that Ken Ham would place such an important role, an important responsibility in one person, Harry Sanders, who we know nothing about, right? Go to Answers in Genesis webpage and look up Harry Sanders and try to find out anything about him. What's his background? By what authority does he have to write on this topic? What does he know? Does he know anything about science? Does he know anything about theology? Is he any form of scholar? Right? Harry Sanders has written a lot of articles for Answers in Genesis. These articles have all the hallmarks of having been written by him. Now, Ken Ham is very clear to say that these weren't all written by one person, that they're a team effort. A team can still be one person who wrote almost all of it, and then others come alongside, dinker around with it, and have some input. But they still represent, at a core, one person's vision. And the thing is, this isn't Ken Ham's vision. He approves of it, obviously. It's like this is his mouthpiece to say things that he isn't explicitly saying himself. He says he approves of these statements, but it's not like he wrote these words himself. I don't think, what I think confuses me here is, I don't think he understands any of this stuff. I don't think Ken Ham really understands these arguments, other than the sort of the big picture philosophy of our audience doesn't understand and it's confusing and we need to be clear, and other creationists are being too complicated and appearing to be under the influence of evolution, using evolutionary terms, and that is causing problems. It's causing, cognitive dissonance among our followers. It makes us look like we're divided and we're not saying the same thing. In a way, it's kind of saying, we understand they are kind of saying the same thing, but we want them to just tone it down. Treat your audience as dumb as we treat our audience, right? Don't confuse them. They don't have a very good understanding of these things. And we're not interested in actually teaching them a better understanding. We're willing to come down to their level and just tell them, here's what you need to know. But at the end of the day, I think most of those who are in the camp of this young earth evolutionist, they understand that those things are not helpful in the long run. They're short-term solutions to making people feel better. But they're not solutions to people who have real questions and will continue to dig. All right? Because there are people out there that will ask more questions and not simply read the blurb in Answers in Genesis handbook and the Answers book and say, okay, I don't have to ask another question. All right, so back to, I'm just stunned that Ken Ham would place the future of Answers in Genesis in the hands of an unknown actor. Known to him, maybe. Not known to anybody else. And, of course, I've calling that person by a nickname today. And if you didn't catch the nickname, Huxley. I've been calling him Huxley. Huxley was Darwin's Bulldog, right? That's the That's his nickname. Huxley was sort of like the person that pounded the pulpit, all right, for Darwin. Darwin's biggest defender, right? Pushing Darwin's ideas out and popularizing them. And in a way, that's what Harry Sanders is doing here. He's the bulldog for Ken Ham. And this, I don't necessarily, not saying this in the nicest sense, right? This is sort of like, he's saying things that are more aggressive than Ken Ham would be himself, although Ken Ham can certainly be very aggressive. But by being under the guise of not having an author, even though there is an author, no author there, no one to like specifically blame or say like, you got that wrong. Harry Sanders is the mouthpiece suddenly of Answers in Genesis, saying things and going far beyond, I think, what Ken Ham actually understands and knows about science. And so Ken Ham doesn't understand how incompetent these articles are. They sound good to him. Oh, yeah. I mean, in fact, Ken Ham has become a caricature of himself. He's said so many things so many times that he has created Harry Sanders. You could view Harry Sanders as the ultimate, you could say the ultimate end product of Ken Ham's constant rhetoric, right? It's like taking Ken Ham to the extreme, taking him out to the logical ends of where that his thought leads to, I think, places that Ken Ham would probably never really think he would ever go, but not realize that when other people take his words and continue to follow his logic, they're going to end up in these very precarious places that Harry Sanders finds himself in terms of some of his ideas. And so Ken Ham has created, these monsters. And these are the ones now that are coming in to his organization. And they're becoming the voices of Answers in Genesis. And I don't know how much control others in the organization have, or whether they have enough willpower to sort of hold back. Because, this is, I mean, we're now just getting into what are the politics at Answers in Genesis. But I mean, he's cultivated such a group that is doesn't really have the capacity for holding themselves back, right? They all are feeding off each other, and it just kind of makes it worse and worse and worse. Anyway, this is going to be really interesting to see where this goes from here. 2 or 3 more articles, I think, that are going to be part of this series on young Earth evolution. And there's been a couple in the past I just haven't talked about yet. There's a lot of interesting stuff in them. I'll try to parse that out into a few other videos at some other point. I feel bad I really do. I really feel bad for Todd Wood and some of his colleagues that are caught up in this, because I'm not sure how they should respond. I mean, I think the articles are rather petty, and they're so wrong in so many places. They come demand kind of, you almost have to respond, but by responding, you just sort of make this division look worse. And they're caught in a space where there's people like me out there, right, who are not favorably disposed toward young Earth creationism, and sees these kind of divisions. And of course, I'm going to talk about them. How can I not talk about this? This is an important moment in the history of young Earth creationism. I'm interested to see what happens, where it goes. Is that this isn't just going to be something that's an internal, some kind of internal division and strife within young Earth creationism. It's not internal, because they've made it external. They've made it external by making it very public, by allowing hundreds of thousands of people to read their claims about what other young Earth creationists are saying and doing, and how they are a serious impediment to young Earth creationism and a serious danger. And so, of course, I'm going to talk about it, and others are going to talk about this. And ask questions about where does this lead and what does this mean for young Earth creationism. Okay, as usual, having trouble wrapping this up with some profound statement or something like that. So let's just stop here because I've talked way too long, and I'll try to figure out some way to edit this down to some reasonable time, since I'm well over talking for 2 hours about this single article. But fascinating times in the world of young Earth creationism. We'll just stop there, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.